So first of all, welcome. So I'm Ian Peters, I'm the director of the IBE, and it's my pleasure to welcome you to the IBE's annual lecture. And I'd particularly like to welcome those of you who are IBE supporters, but also all of our guests, partners, and indeed anybody else who's wandered in off the street looking for somewhere nice and warm. And it's also my delight to thank our sponsor. Our sponsor didn't want to make such a big deal, but has quietly supported our event, and I'm very pleased that they have done so. And our sponsor this evening is NatWest. So NatWest have very kindly funded the event and the drinks afterwards, even more importantly. So many thanks to them. Fire exits. Now, as you may have noticed, there's a fire exit there. If there is a fire, it's not a drill. And if there is a fire, please don't all rush through there at once, because I might get knocked over in the rush, and I'd much rather that didn't happen. But more seriously, that is one of the fire exits, and the other is back down the way you came in. So those of you at that end can go that way, and those of you at this end can certainly come this way. Now, David Grayson, the chair of our Board of Trustees, is going to do the formal introduction to Richard in a moment. But I just wanted to say a word about the importance of the FRC and our relationship with them. The IB has worked with the FRC for many years, and I think it's fair to say it's been quite a busy time of late for the FRC. It's always busy. The FRC. If you follow the FRC, you'll see hardly a day goes by without some sort of important announcement or other. And just this morning, the FRC announced its review, or formally announced its review of the Stewardship Code. So we're very much looking forward to getting involved in looking at that and working with the FRC. But from our point of view, we were particularly pleased to see the revised Corporate Governance Code launched on the 22nd of January, followed hotly by the guidance in support of the code on the 29th of January. And we were very pleased. Not only did the code focus on internal controls as a key feature, but also placed much greater emphasis on the embedding of a positive culture and the role of the board and the non-executive directors in that. And that fits so well with our agenda at the IBE. And we were also pleased to see reference in the code to our own guidance for boards on embedding an ethical culture in organisations. And I should say, if you haven't had a look at our guidance, I mean, of course you should look at the FRC's guidance, but if you haven't had a look at ours, do go on our website. It is admirably brief. For those of you that still work in analogue, it's 2 pages of A4. For those of you that have moved with the times, it's 12 points. And it's, I think it's a useful document, so do have a look at that. So, I think that's enough from me. I'm going to hand over now to David to introduce Richard, and then we'll listen to Richard, and then we'll have plenty of time for Q&A. Thank you.
Ian, thank you. If I can add my welcome, it is so nice to have a live audience as opposed to seeing lots of little postage stamps on Zoom, which we had to do during the COVID pandemic time. This is our annual lecture. It's one of the few events now that we do face-to-face. We've been running these lectures since the early 1990s, and I'm delighted this evening, particularly at very short notice, that Richard has stepped in for his chair. This is the kind of thing which directors and CEOs have to do from time to time, and delighted that Richard has stepped in. He's 5 months in post, so we have to be a little bit gentle on 2 technical questions. For somebody who's only 5 months in post. But I'm sure that he will handle any questions with great aplomb, because before becoming the CEO of the FRC. He was the CEO of the Civil Aviation Authority, and before that, the Legal Services Board. He's worked in regulation, in social housing. He's also now, I think, a non-exec director on a housing association board. We were just comparing notes on some of the challenges now facing the social housing sector. And I think what's obviously a common theme is what's the role that regulation can play in helping organisations in different sectors to be effective and also to be responsible and ethical. So without more ado, I'm going to invite Richard to give our 2024 annual lecture, and then we'll have a discussion afterwards. Richard.
Thank you very much, and thank you everyone for your time this evening. I can very much concur. It is really nice to see a live audience rather than little tiles on a screen. And thank you, Ian and David, for the invitation to be here. Jan would dearly love to be here and give this lecture, and he sends his best to the IBE. Just so we're clear, at the FRC, we do regard the IBE as a really important source and enabler and for championing the highest standards of ethical behaviour in business. Given this remit, our interest at the Financial Reporting Council, it's obvious that we share a common interest. So I'm really keen that we build on what is already a strong relationship between our organisations into the future. I was particularly interested to read, in preparing for tonight, the recent findings from your ethics risk survey. It didn't surprise me, the headline around business leaders being really worried about the impact of economic risks and how that may translate into the organisation into ethics risks, particularly fraud and misreporting. One of the headlines which caught my attention was how professional firms ranked in their top 3 a failure to meet regulatory standards as one of their concerns. So given our role at the FRC in overseeing and regulating, particularly accountancy audit and the actuarial firms, that had some resonance for me. I'll be interested in slower time exploring that theme with the IBE. As you said, I am quite new to the FRC, 5 months. Took over from John Thompson in October. I do think, though, that it's really important that we're clear about what the vision for the FRC should be. I'm quite clear that we should keep it simple. I think the FRC has a really exciting role, I would regard as a core public interest, to support public and market trust and confidence in audit, corporate governance and financial reporting. In doing so, we support competitiveness and economic growth in this country. I'm quite excited by that vision and remit. I mean, clearly, I think it's one that resonates with a lot of people. The arguments are normally in the how do we go about achieving it, the choices we make and the pace we must go through. I've said this before, there is always a seductive trap that new chief execs are lured into, which is at the maximum peak of your ignorance in your early days, you're expected to have very profound thoughts on the future of the industry and the organisation that you run. For me, probably having fallen into that trap in the past, I came to the FRC with a clear priority to engage with folk, listen with folk. And also, I am a believer, I've been around regulation, both on the public side and the private side. There is much more that unites us than divides us, even though in regulation often what you see in the press and what you see played out is the points of division. And actually when you strip it back, the regulator, those that we regulate, those that support the professions, we do have common cause. And that point about public interest being based on public trust and confidence, I think is ever so important. And of course, I don't think we can do that. I don't think you can support high levels of public trust and confidence in governance, in reporting, in audit, unless we have high standards of ethics. And this is one of the reasons why I was keen to jump at the chance to be here tonight and support the work of the IBE. We know that where companies are well governed, then they report high quality information, which is audited to an appropriate standard. It is reliant on high ethical standards. It's a conversation, I got Michael here from the Institute, it's a conversation we've had that, what defines the profession? When you think about it, what actually defines the profession, whether it be accounting, auditing, medicine, actually, when you strip away at it, other than, a lot of good training, a lot of diligence, a lot of public trust, actually that public trust is often bedrocked by a expectation that those carrying that profession will adopt very high ethical standards. And actually, if you haven't got that, if you haven't got a code of ethics, you're just a service industry like anybody else, would be my very stark, and I appreciate uncomfortable observation. So for me, ethics are important not just to business behaviour, but they're also, for me, quite intrinsic to the nature of the profession. I also think that when it comes to good ethics, we should never regard them as a nice to have, as a bit of an add-on. Public and politicians see quite quickly through marketing guff. I think it's really important, and this is linked to the point of culture, that culture needs to embed and lead when it comes to ethics. It can't just be seen as an add-on and a nice to have. And of course, we've all seen, haven't we, that there are examples out there of companies and organisations that have differentiated themselves in terms of public trust because they are relied on to have high ethical standards. We've also seen the reverse, have we not, where companies have imploded quite quickly because there has been quite an existential run on the business because of a breakdown of public trust. So for me, the issue of ethics is really important, I think, to good business conduct, and actually links and chimes quite nicely, I think, with the vision of the FRC, although very happy to have that debated tonight. Of course, many regulated professions, including the UK accountancy profession, which we oversee alongside the Institute, have their codes of ethics that drive that behaviour. I think it's also important that we recognise that a lot of those codes of ethics okay, it's not. It's not me. Had that rather embarrassing moment where I thought, is it me? But it's not me, just for the record. The phone's there. An important point is to recognise that we operate in an international dimension. And it's very important, particularly the work that the FRC does in developing ethical standards. Yes, we want to work with the professions closely and the businesses closely in the UK, but we also want to harness and see what's going on globally. And actually, particularly the large firms, the large businesses, one of their messages for me in my first few months is, Richard, it's really important that the UK has alignment at the international level when it comes to standards. So working across international boundaries, I think, is important. For the professions that we regulate, we take a principles-based approach. Other regulators do something similar. And the fundamental principles that we base our approach on hopefully shouldn't surprise this audience. There are things in terms of integrity, objectivity, professional competence and due care, confidentiality, and professional behaviour. I think they are enduring principles, and actually principles that passport across professional domains. Accountants and auditors, for us, are expected to identify those situations and behaviours that could pose a threat to those fundamental principles and seek to safeguard against those threats. And this is why I make this point about it's really important that professions, yes, we are going to have individuals that are driven by a commercial imperative. Absolutely, it is right and proper and expected that we do so. But what marks out a profession for me is that upholding what I regard, and apologies if this comes across in any way pious, it's not meant to be, that higher calling to that ethical conduct. And I believe that's what the public expect of professions and companies that are acting in a ethical way. Again, I think it's worth noting that when you look at our cases where we take enforcement action, as a regulator. We don't take that many cases, but they do get a lot of attention. I do worry that they get more attention, and it conveys an image which isn't quite in keeping with the facts, but that's a separate point. But when you look at the nature of the cases that we take, often they turn on ethical issues, ethical judgments, or failings of independence. So not only do I believe that ethics is a differentiator for a profession and good business, there's also a clear regulatory locus here. If you look at the cases that we take where we find shortfalls, often it's in that area of ethics. Before I move on from the subject of ethics in particular, just two final observations I would offer from my recent experience. The first is the link, and it was mentioned earlier on, between ethics and culture. And look at case studies around the world. We've had some recent case studies in our world, whether it be exam cheating in North America or misuse of information in Australia. The question of ethical behaviour can't really be separated from the wider issue of prevailing company leadership and culture. So it's really important to, I think, when we think about ethics, also think about how that's embedded in a system of leadership and also the prevailing culture. Is the culture sort of pro-ethics? Or actually, if you believe that ethics are really important, do you find the culture a lonely place to work? These are questions that I think are very important. It's why the FRC has worked with UK audit firms to understand their cultures and seek to improve them. Now, clearly this takes time. You all know that you don't change cultures overnight, but part of our role is actually just to nudge the firms to recognise that leadership and culture set in tone really matters if you want to drive the right ethical behaviours throughout the organisation. The hackneyed management maxim that culture eats strategy for breakfast, many of us have heard it and recited it. And there is a reason why, because actually it has a resonance in reality. Just stepping aside from my recent experience at the FRC, at the Civil Aviation Authority, which is regarded as having quite a mature, long-held, long-established approach to regulation, the things that really differentiated our confidence in the ability of the company to provide a safe and secure service, which the public expects, often turned on their management systems and their culture. You know, most of the companies would say to us, look at these checklists, tick, tick, tick. Look at these red, amber, green, green with green. Actually, a lot of the comfort that we took as a regulator was in that area of leadership and culture, and whether they set the right tone in the organisation to really drive the right behaviours. When it came to safety, it could never be compromised. My own view, for what it's worth, is I think there are some learnings from that regime that might be useful for us to consider more broadly in the work that we do at the FRC. The second observation, if I may, that I would offer on ethics is I think all of us who are interested in this space are having to think about the application of ethics in quite a fast-moving environment at the moment, quite a turbulent world, technological change. And although some of the principles that I spoke to earlier might be seen as enduring, actually how they apply in the reality of tomorrow, I think requires some careful teasing out. I mean, two such cases I think will require careful attention. The first is in relation to new technology. If you look at the rapid pace of AI and machine learning, there's probably not an organisation that isn't asking themselves the question, what does AI mean for us? And actually, by the time you've answered that question, actually the question you thought you were answering has probably changed because it's moving so fast. But what does that mean in an ethical world? I had a real issue in my last couple of years at the CAA because actually AI, machine learning, new technologies were really increasing at a rapid pace. And we, like many regulators, you get yourself into quite a strange and complex universe where are you regulating a technology or are you actually regulating the human ecosystem that's wrapped around it? I always took the view that actually it's not for me to regulate the technology, it's for me to understand why, and someone who put it in place has assured themselves that it would meet public interest outcomes. And actually, for me, that worked quite well and has been copied across the world in aviation. It probably offers some lessons for us when it comes to AI. But again, in conversation, it's probably worth us touching upon this point. The second area where it's moving apace, of course, is in the sustainability area. And what does ethics mean there? We are, interesting conversation about whether the ethical standards and the principles and the processes, the practices that we apply to, if you like, hard financial data, the back end of the annual report and accounts, should apply equally when it comes to sustainability. And actually, it's likely that the skill sets that we're going to need when it comes to sustainability reporting assurance are going to be much broader than the traditional skill sets that we've seen at the back end of the annual report and accounts. In which case, how do we imbue them with a sense of ethics in a way that we all avoid what might be described, I think it's described as greenwashing. Because again, that's not going to lead to public trust and confidence. One of our roles, of course, is to set standards on UK premium listed businesses through the UK Corporate Governance Code. Although I'm pleased to say, and it's humbling, that the Corporate Governance Code has a much broader resonance when it comes to good practice than just premium listed companies, and has been replicated around the world. Obviously, it doesn't set out an ethical code per se, but as was mentioned earlier on, it does set out good principles and practices for governance, for leadership, which sets the right and should encourage the right cultures, which I believe should be conducive to the pursuit of high ethical standards. We recently undertook what actually was for us the largest ever consultation on that UK corporate governance code. Partly that was at the behest of government who were looking for us to add certain things to the code. Partly it was at the instigation of ourselves where, through our work we had identified certain areas that we thought might warrant change. The interesting thing for me is that consultation became a lightning rod for lots of conversations on the state of UK corporate governance. And actually, as my colleagues at the FRC know, because I was learning the ropes, I was forever coming back from conversations saying, I've just heard this is in the code. Where in the code does it say that? Because that sounds quite bonkers. And then putting me right and saying, actually, Richard, that doesn't say that in the code. The code is 11 pages with lots of white space, and actually, if you ignored the white spaces and printed it out, analog style, as you said, it's probably about 6 pages. But I do appreciate that around governance there has been an accretion of regulatory expectations over the past couple of decades. Not so much from the FRC, but there are other regulators, there's Company Act changes, there's FCA rules, etc., etc. So I do appreciate that the FRC's Corporate Governance Code nests within a broader system, and we need to be conscious of that broader system. It's also, as many of you know, the code based on a comply or explain principle, which I believe is very, very powerful and important. It's not hard law as such, because I'm often being asked, how do you regulate against the code? And then having to explain what we believe comply or explain actually means. But I was very conscious in engaging with the consultation process and talking to folk that there's always a risk in regulation that things become a one-way ratchet. You can always find someone who will say, you need to add this to the code, and taken in isolation, it's a good idea. But actually, one of the roles of the regulator, I think, is to step back and ask ourselves whether the totality and stock of what we're requiring on people is actually a fair and reasonable burden for them to share. So as well as looking at the merits of individual proposals, I think it's really important for us to, as a regulator, understand the practical realities of how our work translates. So when we write a expectation in the code, what does it mean in the boardroom? What does it mean for audit committees? It's okay for us to have a small principle, which is a small number of words, but will that create an industry that we need to be conscious of? And I don't think we can be blind. I don't think we can say that's for industry to worry about. I think it is important for us to understand that. And particularly in an arena where it is likely that, more likely than not, the businesses, audit committees, and particularly the large audit firms will take a cautious and risk-averse approach to these things. How many of us have gone to audit committees where we've said, well, it's not quite a rule, but it's suggested as best practice by the regulator. Most audit committees at that point say, well, I think we should do it. So we need to understand that, and I think take a bit of a self-denying ordinance as a regulator when it comes to, let's just be careful what we're putting out there. There are certain things that should be seen as clear expectations, but if we're issuing things that are best practice, it's guidance, we need to be really clear how that translates in practice. And actually, is there more we can do with partners? Because actually it doesn't need to be us here. We're not the oracles of all wisdom at the FRC. Where we can work with partners, whether it be the IBE, the Institute, why wouldn't we wish to consider that? And as I've already mentioned, it's important for us to work as part of the system, particularly where the other regulators are concerned. The FCA would be a particularly important regulator for us, the PRA, indeed for financial services, with apology. So for me, I don't see this being about, our quest is about more regulation or less regulation. I see this is about making sure what we do is smart regulation or better regulation. And this was the thinking that really guided our outcome on the corporate governance code. Because although a lot of the earlier consultation naturally was exploring ideas to add to the code, I was really keen to bring it back to a really hard-edged assessment. What is it that we really need to do that will move the dial on the quality of governance in the UK? What is it that we can really say will move the dial, and what is it that would be a nice to have? Or actually there are other bodies out there that have got views which others can rely on. It doesn't necessarily have to be an FRC hegemony over that particular space. And as a result of that, we ended up by saying actually the thing that really matters in this raft of proposals is internal controls. It is the thing that you would, I believe, expect a well-functioning board, audit committee to be on top of. And there were other proposals which we didn't take forward, particularly in relation to expectations on audit committees, on ESG issues, expanding the D&I expectations in the code, and adding provisions related to overboarding. Not saying that any of that is unimportant, far from it. And it's difficult. We had very difficult board and executive conversations about actually, do we really feel comfortable just pushing that to one side? But it is important, I think, that regulators make those hard calls, and the bar for adding stuff does need to be more than it would just be nice to have. It's got to be a clear bar that we can get over. I should say when it came to internal controls, a large body of responses said, look, that is bullseye, that is absolutely essential, that you look at that, and actually case studies are littered with corporate accidents and failures where when you trace it back, the governance really was asleep at the wheel when it came to internal controls. The current governance code, I won't test people on this, but the current governance code already includes two important expectations in relation to internal controls. First, that boards should monitor the company's risk management and internal control framework at least annually and carry out a review of its effectiveness. And second, the current code expects the monitoring review will cover all material controls, including financial, operating, reporting and compliance controls. It was interesting for me that lots of people said, are you expanding internal controls outside of the financial domain? And the answer is no, it's already in the code that actually a board should have oversight of all material controls. And many do, of course. This is not a criticism of boards. Many do this already. What's new in the latest update of the code is really a transparency and accountability requirement on boards, which is that they should explain through a statement in the annual report a description of how the board has monitored and reviewed the effectiveness of the framework. Hopefully it should be reasonably straightforward, but I think it will be helpful for it to be transparent. And important, and this is where I think it gets a bit sharper edge, a declaration of the effectiveness of the material controls as of the balance sheet date. So, what part of good governance is getting, people to ask the right question at the right time in the right way? And actually, by putting that onus on boards, that the expectation is going to be on you to sign a declaration that on your view on the effectiveness of those material controls, then that just sharpens up the incentive, I think, on particularly the non-execs to take that declaration seriously and add to the governance quality. And then finally, a description of any material controls that have not operated effectively as at that balance sheet date, and any actions that are proposed to improve them. I am very mindful that the needs of businesses will vary. That much is very clear. So for me, it's really important that boards determine their own view on what should comprise their material internal controls. I believe it's really important that boards should think for themselves. I can't tell you how many people have asked me, Richard, when you say boards should think for themselves, what do you actually mean? Wow. But look, I'm new and I'm learning the ropes, but boards should think for themselves. It's really important in that crucible of governance that boards think for themselves. So that is a question that we put back for boards. What you decide, in running this business, in governing this business, what do you think are the material controls? What assurances would you like around those material controls? And how effective do you think those material controls would be? And we've deliberately been shy in offering too much prescriptive guidance in this territory. We've been asked lots of questions like, well, how many material controls do you think on average people should look at? Do you think it should include this and that? Do you expect external verification or external assurance? I think it's really important. I think over time what we'll see is after a couple of years where people get into the groove of this, we will see what people do. There will be an element of convergence around what is seen as, if not good practice, common practice. But I think it's really important that having set the challenge, we allow boards now to think for themselves rather than, I think, fall into a trap of offering too much prescription. Very happy to debate that if folk feel that the balance is not in the right place. It should be obvious from what I've said, but let me stress it, that the approach that we're taking more generally on governance but also on internal controls, we believe is principled based. We believe it's proportionate. It relies, as I said, on boards thinking for themselves, coming to their own judgments are important. We believe quite strongly that this is better suited to the UK context, the UK legal, cultural, business context, than approaches you see elsewhere. For those of you who are familiar, particularly in the United States, you've got the Sarbanes-Oxley regime, very, very different when it comes to internal controls and the expectations thereof than what we're doing in the UK. One is not better, one is not worse. I think we have a proud and long tradition in this in the UK of promoting a principles-based approach to governance. I do believe it's better suited to our circumstances. It is a point, I'm sure, that scholars and others, practitioners, will debate, and very much welcome your views later on that subject. We've also got to be practical. A lot of businesses have said to us, look, some of these changes might take time. So we have said that we will give an extra year of transition when it comes to boards developing the statement they need to issue for the annual report and accounts, albeit many of them are out of the traps already doing the preparatory work. I think one thing, given the nature of the work that the IBE does, the audience may be interested in, I think one thing that may just be worth us keeping an eye on is to what extent will boards, particularly in certain sectors, require the preservation of their, what I may describe as reputation or ethics or integrity as absolutely key to their risk management, and therefore should have some degree of material control around it. I mean, for instance, for a lot of professional services firms actually will regard a reputation for trust and ethics as something that is absolutely key to their risk management. Well, if that's the case, are they also thinking about the internal controls? Are there any material ones? And I think that would be worth us, for those of us who are interested in that debate over ethics, I think it is useful for us to see how that plays out. In updating the governance code, I wanted to use the opportunity to amplify our view on what comply or explain actually means. Because many people have said, but Richard, doesn't it actually mean comply or else? Because actually, when we're in the board, when we're in the audit committee, it's really hard to, think your way through, having to explain. And that's before the proxy advisors, get involved. Our view is very clear. We would encourage boards, investors and their advisors, which do include the proxies, to actively encourage the use of that flexibility around comply or explain. We're really clear at the FRC in setting the code that compliance can mean either applying the provisions as drafted or setting out a cogent and justified explanation for why you're not doing that, but following the principles of good governance in any event. And actually, the reason why I personally are interested in this is in aviation safety regulation, often the businesses that gave us most assurance were the ones that actually filed with us a difference to the rules, but what they were able to do was demonstrate that they had really thought through how the principle of safety would apply to their business model and how they just needed to do something a bit different, but actually they met the principle, they didn't quite meet the rules, but what it gave us was great confidence that they had thought for themselves. So I've been very clear, particularly with boards, with non-execs that I've met, audit committees. Frankly, obviously, it's for you to make the decision that is best suited for your business, but if you gave me the choice of setting out a transparent and cogent explanation, or simply, in a more sort of cowardly way, ticking a compliance box, I would much rather the former. I believe the former actually is a demonstration of better governance. But again, very happy to debate that in this audience. Before I leave the revised governance code, I should just mention the associated guidance we issued, just so you can get a sense of our thinking. It is important that people see the guidance as not the code. It's not the code. It's one of the reasons why we published it a bit later. The guidance should be seen as hopefully helpful, hopefully informative, hopefully people find it valuable. But people shouldn't see the guidance as a set of rules that the FRC expect. The FRC expects what's in the governance code with the comply or explain principle. The FRC doesn't expect you to meet the terms of the guidance. You can do. Actually, a lot of it would make sense, I'm sure, but it's really important that people don't confuse the code with the guidance when it comes to regulatory expectations. So what we did do, and you may say we should have done this a long time ago, we put the guidance together in one place, hopefully you found in an accessible digital format. We also reduced it by about a fifth. I don't know if people noticed that. I'm not sure we actually went to town publishing that number, but we did reduce the guidance by about a fifth, really trying to get a lock on, what is the essence here that we need to put out? What's the minimum that we think is essential to support good governance? The other thing we did in the guidance, to make it clear that it is guidance, not the expectations of the code, is where there were references to boards must. So it looked like we were imploring that you must. We were very clear to soften that to boards may. Just to make it clear that the guidance, frankly, is optional compared to the code, albeit I really hope it is helpful out there. Now that we've finished the process to update the code, our mind is now turning to the other side of the coin, as it were, which is the stewardship code, which really relates to the behaviours of investors and the investor community. And partly this was motivated when we looked at the responses to the governance code. Actually, a lot of responses we got related not to the governance code, but also to broader issues of stewardship and the relationship between boards and investors. And of course, this is part of a bigger conversation going on at the moment, particularly pitched in terms of the narrative of how do we help UK growth. There's an angle there around listings in London. There's lots of chief exec pay. There's lots of things that are going into the mix here, bubbling up, which go way beyond, certainly way beyond the governance code, and actually way beyond the stewardship code. But we did think that given that we're custodians of that stewardship code, the time was right for us to review it. It hasn't been reviewed for a number of years. And we will start with actually quite an open-minded approach. No one has said to us, Richard, get rid of the code. Some people have said it needs to be more hard-edged. Some people have said, actually, you need to think about whether it drives the quality of engagement, because too much of it gets delegated and becomes an overhead of compliance, and we've traded quantity for quality. And I'm really keen to get under the skin of that, because it is quality that matters, it's outcomes that matters. So look, we started it today, we launched the review today. We are really interested in people's views on the stewardship code and stewardship more generally. I mean, even if we're not responsible for the issue, it's useful to understand the context, and because we work with other regulators, work with government, obviously we can make them aware of any broader issues that are raised there. Particularly the FCA have a role there, and the pension regulator, because both of those regulators use the stewardship code in their own regulatory regime. So although it's not a regulatory requirement from the FRC, downstream it becomes a requirement from those two regulators for firms and investors that are in those sectors. So before I wrap up, I did mention at the start what I see as the vision for the FRC. Again, very happy to debate it. But one thing I've appreciated in my career in regulation is actually, as a regulator, often how you go about your work and engage is as important as what you do. And it's really important, I think, as the FRC, we hold ourselves to high standards on how we go about that. So in terms of the how, I really want to see an FRC that is well engaged with its stakeholders. We're out there, we're talking, we're engaging, we're listening. We won't always agree, but that's the nature of regulation. We can agree disagreeably. I think that's always much better than to disagree disagreeably. But I think it's really important that the FRC is open, is porous, and is well engaged. The second thing for me is I really want the FRC to understand the practical realities of its work. What does it really mean to boards? What does it really mean to audit committees? What does it really mean to investors? What does it really mean to the professions and the firms that work touches on? And let's debate those issues. And then thirdly, and perhaps most important for me, I really want the FRC to be an organisation that has the self-confidence and, dare I suggest, the humility to accept that it can always learn and it can always improve what it does. We're not the oracles of wisdom. I don't think any regulator is. I don't think any organisation is. And I think it's really important that we adopt that stance. And actually working with partners, and indeed the IBE, very important and good source for us to draw from in that regard. So let me end there. Hopefully there was food for thought. If there's things you agree with, love to hear that. If there's things you disagree with, equally I'd love to hear that as well, or anything you think I've missed entirely. Thank you very much.